I will go through the text.
We're live. Yeah.
All right. Hello, everyone.
I'm going to share the group.
Okay.
Guessing.
Welcome back, everyone, to Capital Comrades, Chinese Marxism, instance or episode number 9. Today, we're going over 3 works by Deng in the second volume of the selected works. The first one is Uphold, the Four Cardinal Contradictions, published in March 30th, or on March 30th.
Uphold the Four Cardinal Principles, by the way, Tim.
Yep. Well, God. Look, I've just given up on. I'm just expecting an error in every single time I try.
It's a sort of a running joke of ours that Tim always messes up the introduction. Sorry, we're just sharing the thing. But anyway, Tim, you can continue for we'll see how you do. I think you're getting a little better every time. Let's see if you get the group name this time.
Oh, did I mess it up again?
No. I just want to see. We'll see if you get it.
Oh, look, I already said it, I'm pretty sure. So we're just going to keep going. All right. So okay. Yeah, you got to upload the 4 cardinal principles, though. You don't want to uphold them. So this is after Mao has died. The next one is, can we develop a market economy under socialism, which was an interview in 1979, November 26th. And the last one is the present situation and the tasks before us in 1980. So on the first one, this is an address to, I think it's the third in a series of conferences preparing the project of the Four Modernizations, which involves a transition from an earlier period of China's economic development. One of them being the iron rice bowls, if I'm remembering correctly, which was paying workers all the same. This is in the Four Modernizations sees a change to paying workers based off of productivity. There's a couple of more things going on there, but with
the iron rice bowl is maintained until the 90s, by the way, just to be clear. Okay. But yeah, they do shift to like a miniaturized private sector.
So then there are the 4 cardinal principles, which we will get into, but then in the second one, we have an interview with Gibney. I'm not sure what doesn't give the full name there, where it just goes through. Deng provides an overview that summarizes a lot of stuff we've been talking about. And
Gibney. Yeah, I was trying to. Did we look up who that was last time?
Yes. It's at the end. It's Frank Gibney. Frank B. Gibney, Vice Chairman of the Compilation Committee of the Encyclopedia Britannica.
Okay. Yeah, I do love. I absolutely love, and I love how, I don't know why he's talking to a guy from the Encyclopedia Britannica committee. I do love in this volume just the total lack of editorial commentary. Like, you don't even know the guy's name. You don't know why Deng is talking to this guy. It's just like, here you go, right? And then there are just inexplicable omissions too. I can only attribute the fact that they didn't put the 1974 UN speech in the book to the fact that the UN must hold some kind of like copyright over like its own statements. I mean, that's the only thing I can assume, because why else would you like not have it there, right? It's one of his most famous addresses. And he actually references it later as well. Sorry, did you want to add anything more, Tim? Was there anything else you want to say?
Yeah, just the last one. Just to say something on the last one. It's more involving the Four Modernizations, but it's Deng preparing for the 80s. And kind of an address, a criticism of what the party and what needs to be done, and just preparing to reach the Four Modernizations by the beginning of the century.
Yeah. Okay, so we're going to start then with Uphold the Four Cardinal Principles from 1979. Now, one thing we could start out by doing, which might be interesting, the 4 cardinal principles here are reiterated quite consistently by Deng, and really throughout the text more broadly. And also this idea of seek facts from truth, right? Which is a quote from Mao. But I know later in the text when I was reading, he actually said that the 4 cardinal principles, that they have a basis, or that they were said by Mao. Ernesto, do you want to maybe like pull up a bit of research on that? The 4 cardinal principles. Our resident researcher, Ernesto. Okay, but in the meantime, we can start to move
give me a
through.
moment.
So I've just highlighted a few sections from here. So he talks a little bit here on the second or third page of the essay about the conflict with Vietnam. So again, I said like in the last session we had that in the exact year, it was like 78 or 79. Someone could double check that. But China engaged in a brief military conflict with Vietnam. And the details of this are somewhat disputed. Obviously, Mao Zedong had been friends with Pol Pot, sort of a disastrous episode in the history of the Chinese Communist Party. Though, as I said, Pol Pot is the ultimate. He's the ultimate ultra-leftist because he was, as far as I'm aware, he's the only actually existing Marxist leader to abolish money altogether. So, hopefully, I'm sure he'll have some enthusiasts in our group.
I'm sure. Yeah.
But I have to, it's not just my job to be here. I have to also stamp out deviations, and uphold the mass line, our mass line. So, we're open. We'll actually discuss this later because there's some stuff I want to raise about this. But anyway, yeah, so there was a conflict between China and Vietnam, and the conflict basically revolved around the fact that you had the Sino-Soviet split, right? In the early 1960s, you had Khrushchev and Mao kind of butting heads. I think like 1 million Soviet troops were amassed along the Chinese border. In that time, you had, it's interesting to bring up with the Uyghur thing today, in Xinjiang, because I think the Soviet Union was exploiting sovereigntist elements in that region as well. But there was concern in China about the possibility of Soviet invasion or encroachment, in Asia. And Vietnam had been traditionally allied to both China and the Soviet Union, but when they saw that this fight was beginning to happen, and when they felt it was necessary to take sides, because at a certain point you sort of had to say where you stood, Vietnam kind of went with the Soviet Union, right? And there were some statements that were made by the Vietnamese leadership in that time in terms of, Vietnam is the communist power in Asia. There were concerns about Vietnamese expansionism, if I'm not mistaken, into areas like Cambodia and Thailand. So what China did, now you got to remember that after the Cultural Revolution, and Deng will talk a lot about this in the text, the PLA, the People's Liberation Army, was quite disorganized, right? There's a lot of overlapping bureaucracy. Deng constantly brings up the fact that it was undersupplied and overmanned, right? And actually later on he'll go and say like, well, one thing we should be doing is trying to find other professions for people in the military. He even says like, if they can work as secondary school teachers, that'd be much more helpful because we just have too many people, right? Mm-hmm. But one thing they did to try to test the mettle of some of their military reforms and also to send a message to Vietnam was they briefly invaded a border territory in Vietnam. And again, I could double check the year, but I read about this in the Vogel's biography of Deng as well.
It was 79.
779. Okay. Yeah.
Beginning like March, February, March.
Yeah. So that was planned from the get-go to just be like a short-term operation that was meant to like intimidate Vietnam and to try to check what the concern regarding their territorial ambitions. China was successful in doing that. They broke through a few Vietnamese counties and kind of tore things up. Deng himself, he didn't want to engage in a more serious warfare. He didn't think that after the Cultural Revolution, and given that Vietnam had been an ally and was a communist country, he didn't think there would be public support for that kind of thing and people wouldn't like it. He knew that. So they came in and it tore through a few Vietnamese counties, and then they basically had a planned withdrawal. Right. So it was a very, very sort of psychological attack operation, right? If that kind of makes sense. Now, there are different ways of interpreting what happened. The PLA was successful in their attack, but they withdrew before Vietnam could fully engage, right, and resist. And they actually got involved in some pretty tough fighting. The Vietnamese army, right, the army of the Viet Minh was a lot more battle hardened by that point than the PLA, and a lot more disciplined. Right, look at the Vietnamese. Right, they beat the French, they beat the Japanese, they beat the French. Right, they beat the Americans. Right, so the Chinese did succeed in that operation, but they had it wasn't like a glorious success. Mm-hmm. Right, they ran into more difficulty than they might have liked. So just to say, so he addresses this at the beginning here. The victory in our counterattack waged in self-defense on Vietnam has immensely heightened China's prestige in the international struggle against hegemonism, which, again, is the word used to describe both the Soviet Union and the States, as well as the prestige of the army among our own people. This counterattack has demonstrated that our army still deserves to be called the valiant and battle-tested People's Liberation Army, and that it remains the great wall of defense of our socialist modernization. So a bit of hype, right?
Mm-hmm.
And then he continues, he talks a little bit about Mao Zedong in terms of foreign policy. It is also clear how brilliant and farsighted were his policy decisions on this issue, namely that China should side with the third world countries and strengthen its unity with them, try to win over the second world countries for a concerted effort against hegemonism, and establish normal diplomatic relations with the United States and Japan. The strategic principle in these policies have been invaluable in rallying the world's people to oppose hegemonism, changing the world political balance, frustrating the Soviet hegemonist's arrogant plan to isolate China internationally, improving China's international environment, and heightening its international prestige. And by the way, I think sometimes there's the impression in, people have sort of a superficial grasp of Chinese history. Whether you think, personally, I think the Sino-Soviet split was awful for the international communist movement. Really,
Right.
one of the terrible things. And I know I'm reading now, and I know that Palmiro Togliatti, the leader of the Communist Party in Italy, prior to his death in 1964, that one of the last things he was trying to do before he died was to prevent this from happening. But I just want to say that I think it's a terrible thing. But there is a bit of a misconception about this. In the sense that a lot of people think, the decision to swing and sort of, equivocally work with the United States to counter Soviet influence, that this is a consequence of the Deng era, right?
Mm-hmm.
That shift was already instigated earlier with Mao, right? Mao was the one who met Kissinger, right? Mao was the one, they got recognized by the UN, right? He was the one who had taken a fairly hostile position toward Khrushchev. So again, just to clarify that. Did you guys want to bring anything to attention here? Any comments on this, by the way?
Yeah,
Right. Go ahead, Tim.
Yeah, one thing I was wondering, so because we read Deng's UN speech, and
Mhm.
one thing that I've been noticing is that this three worlds thing we've been seeing pop up more in the later half of the 70s. Do you know when Mao? Because Deng attributes the idea to Mao. Do you know when Mao came up with that idea, or is this more Deng's idea that that has some connection to Mao, but he's really trying to integrate into Mao Zedong thought as part of his own kind of picking up the mantle in a certain way?
Well, I couldn't point my finger to a text, but I will say that he attributes this vision to Mao in this passage, and that 74 speech was given before Deng was leader. That was given actually when he was called back to Beijing. So, I mean, as to who came up with it, I mean, Mao had ghostwriters. It was a party, right? So I don't know whose idea it was in the first place, but Mao clearly had enunciated that idea and supported it, right? Quite fully, I think, right? You wouldn't be saying those things, right, at the UN, right? If they weren't being done with the full assent of the leadership, right? So, so that's anyone. Did anyone else have any comments, by the way, Ernesto or anyone?
Yeah. So you asked me about the four principles, right? They're ahead in the text, and not only are they going to be listed, but Deng goes pretty thoroughly into each one and how it's meant to be modernized. So we'll be going through them. But before we do that, I just wanted to, point a couple of things out that I found in the text. Deng says, generally speaking, we are 20 to 30 years behind the advanced countries in the development of science and technology. And he also says, despite China's vast territory, the amount of arable land is limited, and neither this fact nor the fact that we have a large, mostly peasant population can be easily changed. This is a distinct characteristic which we must take into account in carrying out our modernization program. Right? You wanted to point that out, I guess, as context, maybe, on how Deng approaches the modernizations of the principles, right? Should I list out the principles so we can?
Go ahead.
Mm-hmm.
Okay. So the four cardinal principles are okay. So I'm just going to preface what Deng says here. He says, "What I want to talk about now is ideological and political questions. The Central Committee maintains that to carry out China's four modernizations, we must uphold the four cardinal principles ideologically and politically. This is the basic prerequisite for achieving modernization. The four principles are: we must keep to the socialist road. The second is we must uphold the dictatorship of the proletariat. The third is we must uphold the leadership of the Communist Party. And the fourth is that we must uphold Marxism, Leninism, and Mao Zedong thought. And then he says, as we all know, far from being new, these four cardinal principles have long been upheld by our party. The Central Committee has been adhering to these principles in all its guidelines and policies adopted since the smashing of the Gang of Four, and especially since the third plenary session of the 11th Central Committee, right? Then he criticized the ultra-left position in the next paragraph. He goes over the feudal fascism that we talked about last session about the Gang of Four, right? A little bit of historical context. He talks then about the emancipation of the minds, which I also thought relates very well with this whole idea of the principles. He talks about upholding Marxist-Leninism thought. I'm sorry, Marxism-Leninism and Mao Zedong thought in a way that he says emancipates minds, right? And he makes this point to try to make us think, I guess, of not sticking, not book worshipping, right? But instead developing the science of Marxism, right? Marxism-Leninism in this context, but Marxism, right? I think in a more general context.
Yeah, and it's very interesting. Sorry, continue.
No. Go ahead.
I was going to say his critiques of the Gang of Four are very interesting because, one thing about Deng is he really has, I feel like, quite a classical Marxist viewpoint. I think he's kind of like classical Marxism. He mentions a few essays later, actually, I want to bring up as being specifically important to his reception of Mao. But I think it's best to understand it as traditional Marxism filtered through Mao's writings on contradiction, right? In terms of, and he actually says later, he says class struggle is not the main contradiction now. The main contradiction now, the principal contradiction now is the development of productive forces, right? Yeah. So I find it all quite credible. Actually, an interesting thing about this that I read was that this actually started out again, and I was I'm like, well, again, I think it's really silly to think like these leaders just sit around and go, these are my ideas. There's a real process with this stuff. It would be anti-socialist, we could say, to think that's the way ideas are produced. But I was actually I read a whole article on Wikipedia about how there was a whole, after the Cultural Revolution, the whole effort to reread China's political conundrum in relation to Marx's work, right? And to say what had gone wrong. And that involved critiquing, sort of, again, the voluntarism, kind of the dizzying voluntarism of the Cultural Revolution as not heeding enough these materialist axioms, right? And also I read that there was a revision that they issued to the critique of the Gotha program, which I hate, by the way. I love Marx's work, but I just find it, and we could get into that, and I would love to at some point, but I'm not going to do it all now. But mostly, he talks about Gotha.
Not about the Gotha program, right? But he says specifically, that we insisted that leaders should be regarded as human beings and not demigods, right?
Yeah. Well, this is my main problem with the critique of the Gotha program, is that Marx's approach is mostly dialectical, but in critique of the Gotha program, which was also written for political reasons, he goes into, he's just this is the stages of how this will be built, right? And he can't even liberate his conception of those stages from a substantialist Ricardian theory of value. So I just find it ridiculous because it's the number one text people go to be that isn't socialism. This is what it says socialism is. And it's that just encourages a totally futile and undialectical way of, it's Capital is Marx's main works. If you want to understand how to think socialism, you read Capital carefully and thoroughly, right? But people always want an easy way out, right? They always want to reduce things to a list or which admittedly the Chinese are fond of. But I do get the drift of Deng's critique, which is that that's not adequate, right? It might be provisionally useful, but it's not an adequate way of thinking, right? So there's quite a dialectical sensibility in Deng's thought, and I think it's really, really underexplored in Western discourse. But my point was, in getting around all this, my point was just that they edited Gotha programs, so they added a new stage, So the new stage was like it was basically like it was because Marx says like the value form will not exist in the first stage of communism. Now this is already really goofy because like Marx also says workers will be paid like based on I forget the exact terminology, but like they'll be paid from like a subsistence fund with like basically certificates based on the productivity of their labor or whatever. Like he basically recapitulates the structure of value, you know, while claiming value is gone. So that's the basic problem of it. But they add a new stage and they're like, well, there's this stage where like there is like a commodity exchange, right? But we're moving toward, right, you know, the construction of which, you know, you could say it's a bit like, you know, maybe Lenin's definition of state capitalism or something. But I do think it's, you know, I would say I don't think the Gotha program is like a useful text in particular, but I would say that this thing, if we're going to talk about it, this probably makes it better in the sense of being at least more correspondent with praxis. Like, you know, I mean, that's what Mao says, right? Like the, you know, the criterion of truth is practice, right?
Yeah.
You know, and that's like, you know, that's I think what you have to look at. But I find it interesting with the Gang of Four because he really goes in two directions with the Gang of Four. And it's very interesting, right? Because I find this very interesting because on one hand, he accuses them of like feudalism, right? He's like, oh, they, you know, the division and factionalism they fostered was like a feudal symptom. But on the other hand, he accuses them of like ultra leftism and individualism. And I just think it's very interesting to think about how those principles, you know, the potential overlap between those ideas, you know?
Yeah.
Like, I do feel like there's like, if you look at like a lot of like ultra voluntaristic, like anarchistic expressions of Marxist ideas today, you know, I'm not going to say any names or anything, but I think they do lean toward like this weird, like, you know, like they're actually contrary to the thrust of modernity in a way that I find like completely undialectical and also probably much more unpalatable for people in the third world, except maybe for like third world indigenous groups and stuff who are trying to create autonomous structures outside of circuits like primary circuits of production and stuff. But I think they're quite unpalatable for like third world economies on the whole, right? You know, to think about. I don't know. Do you have any thoughts on that?
I will have to, you know what specifically you're talking about.
Yeah, can you say? Do you want to say more?
No, I'm not going to go more. I'm not going to go into more detail.
Okay. Let's stick to the first principle then, right? We must keep to the socialist road, says Deng, right?
Yeah.
And in his explanation, which is a pretty long paragraph, in summary, what he says is that China, and again, this is why I quoted this whole thing about the 20 or 30 years. He even goes on to say that progress is not measured anymore even on years, but more so on months, weeks, days, right? But my point is that he says China is behind in development, so there's nothing wrong with learning from capitalist countries, because, and I think even a little bit later, he says this whole thing, Conrad, that I remember you quoting or mentioning or alluding to a couple of sessions ago about how there was this is from the next reading then. Okay, from the Market Socialism reading, right? The interview. We'll get to that then. So anyway, he says, and I quote, "If the developed capitalist countries were to rid themselves of the capitalist system, their economy and culture would certainly make greater progress. That is why the progressive political forces in the capitalist countries are trying to study and propagate socialism and are fighting to eliminate the injustices and irrational phenomena endemic in capitalist society and to carry out socialist revolution. We should introduce to our people, and particularly to our youth, whatever is progressive and useful in the capitalist countries. And we should criticize whatever is reactionary and decadent, right?"
Yeah, definitely. And what's your take on that, Ernesto?
Well, I think as a third world citizen, what are we supposed to do if not follow the example of the more developed countries? Are we supposed to figure out our own sciences, you know, from a new? I guess I might be, you know, exaggerating a little bit here with the position, but as he says later again in the interview, there are things to learn from the Soviet Union, and there are things not to learn, right? He mentions specifically the way to develop enterprises, right? And for me, most of the work I've had to do at the factory has been modernizing, right? Bringing in quality control systems imported from outside Mexico in English, which I have to read, right, in English, and then translate, make forms in Spanish, right? Teach the people that work with me how to fill out the forms and stuff like that, and it's all for more efficiency. Of course, that also leads to more profit. But as Deng says, and hey, there's a great quote, and maybe I don't know if Ender watches the mañaneras, the morning conferences that our president gives. Well, he gave a great little, I guess, a phrase. He says that what's not logical certainly sounds metallical, right? Because it's money, right? He's talking about how decisions in law, right, sometimes might not make sense unless you follow a very particular logic, right? And so that's certainly something that I see at work, right? We are implementing the ISO stuff, exactly, the International Standardization of Operations, right? And honestly, it's great, right? It makes things much easier because everything's on paper, right? There's evidence for all the work that is done, right? Things are easier to take track of, but at the same time, you have managers that now that they have this information, overstep their positions, right?
Yeah.
And they abuse their power, right? And I have to mediate with them, right? I have to tell them, hey, I'm giving you this information, right? So you can make their job easier, right? Not harder. And I don't have all the power, so of course sometimes it doesn't go my way. And certainly if we had a state program that said, let's not have this kind of ideology, I think our progress will be much smoother.
Yeah, and it's true. And I think, again, I get the sense that, and I do like when you bring your perspective to these things, also because you work in a production context, right? Which I think is, such a crucial aspect of everything we're talking about, and maybe particularly with Deng. I feel like the political challenge, about the Western thing, it's very interesting because it's like, Marx understood this as well, right? When he writes on India, right, for example, and obviously India, when Marx wrote about it, is quite incomparable with Mexico today. But what he said, they're nevertheless are countries which were less developed than the most developed countries. And what he said was like, he doesn't want to, offer apologia for British colonialism, right? He's very critical of that. But what he says is like, what has occurred as a result of British colonialism also has given the guideline in some respects for India to like claim its independence and modernization, right? So he's like, the question is, how do you take, those practices which the British have introduced in order to exploit India, right? And how do you transform them into something that can actually be applied, right, to benefit the majority of Indians, right? And to achieve the country's liberation. So Marx was very aware of that. Now that's a very controversial essay. I know Aegis Ahmad, the Urdu Marxist scholar, has defended it. In post-colonial circles, it's a controversial essay, but like it's really interesting with like post-colonial ideology in general. I think a lot of the places a lot of the classes and sites it emanates out from, like wealthy Indians and like English-speaking academia, for example. It's like, look at the, in terms of this valorization of like, cultural particularity, and, even at times residually feudal structures, right? Sort of the dignity of them, this kind of thing. I think that the proof is kind of in the pudding. I mean, if you look at countries that have embraced a, Marxist-Leninist, socialist kind of agenda, they have achieved the biggest gains, right? In terms of modernization. And that's not about just saying Marx was right, right? What it's about is, like what Hegel says about, the inexorability of reason, right? It's about trying to stay within, right? The contours of the ideal of rationalization and modernization, but to rethink them in a way, right, that liberates them from their chauvinist contours, their chauvinist dimensions, right? And you can't just apply the same thing in China; you'd apply somewhere else, right? But that doesn't mean that you should. That doesn't mean that you should retreat into like a potentially a rationalist worldview, right?
Yeah.
And just say, you know, and at the extreme, you have like Islamic fundamentalism, right? You know,
and it happens here too, right? Usually, when you don't have rationalism, you have traditionalism.
Yeah, and that's the risk. And I just don't really see the alternative. I don't believe that personally. I don't believe that there really is another. You know, you can go into a notion of the past that invariably ends up, you know, bound up with contemporary economic concerns and so on. Anyway, you know, obviously it's ridiculous to talk about political Islam today, for example, and be like, oh, that's just what they were doing in the past. That's, you know, people talk like, oh, it's just a feudal thing. No, it's its own thing too. But you can, you know, make those patriarchal values very central, or you can try to construct a path of modernization using what you have in front of you, you know, and strategically diverging. And I certainly think the latter approach, you know, tends to be more successful. I think the proof is in history, right, as regards that. But of course, some people find this Eurocentric and so forth, which I don't think is true, you know. But again, it would be Eurocentric to reprise these strategies without realizing that they have to be adjusted, right? And
that's the Eurocentrism,
yeah, and that they have to
adapting them to other, you know, that's the great idea, yeah, of course.
Yeah, well, in a way, it seems kind of like this is the thing too, right? Like if you read like Said, and I'm gonna get a little off topic, but if you read like Said, he's like, you know, the Western man or whatever cannot understand like the Oriental, you know, and he just re-essentializes all these categories. I mean, like the thing you got to understand is like if we're really, I'm not arguing for some kind of like banal post-racialism, like all these forms of domination are real. But what I will say is if we're trying to get to a certain point of enlightenment, I should say, right? You know, you also got to recognize that, you know, Europe, you know, was the wealthiest and most educated region for a long time. They produced a lot of ideas. A lot of those ideas are unfortunately, you know, prejudiced, right? You know, and affected by, you know, the particularity of that context. But that's not to say that there aren't a lot of good ideas that can be adapted. You know, the fact is these cultural distinctions, this is superstructural, right? You know, it's not an absolute essence, right? And when you realize that, that you know, in any region that's went through, you know, a great flourishing of development, right? You know, educationally, culturally, whatever, you're going to find things of value to use, right? Yeah. You know, and maybe tomorrow China will be the center, right? You know, it's like, but I think those, you know, I think looking at the wealthiest, the most, you know, culturally developed zone is always important, right? At any point in human history, right? You know, so that would be just my 2 cents on that. Yeah, so
Tim?
You know, Tim, do you have anything?
Oh no, I'm just listening here. I don't have anything to add.
Should we move on to the second principle?
Do we? Oh yeah, the second principle. Yeah, go ahead.
Yeah. It says, second, we must uphold the dictatorship of the proletariat. Here, again, to summarize the huge paragraph ahead, he talks about the Gang of Four, right, under a specific system that we already described as feudal fascism, right? Deng described, right? And, you know, he says, we do not believe that there is a bourgeoisie within the party, nor do we believe that under the socialist system, a bourgeoisie or any other exploiting class will re-emerge after exploiting classes and the conditions of exploitation have really been eliminated, right? So they promote a certain kind of democracy with certain kind of elements that distinguishes itself by the exclusion of a particular social class, which nevertheless seems to exist, right? Oh, is Conrad gone? Oh no.
Conrad has.
Oh, I just hit the wrong button on my mouse. You know, I got the back thing on my website. Yeah.
Okay. Right. So, well, that's my personal take is that I think it is curious, right? That of course there are bourgeoisie in China. It's just that, no, nevertheless, because I mean, there's like this Jack Ma guy. You know, what are they? Right? They are in proletariat, right? But nevertheless, they have like this particular, I guess, standing in society. What are your takes on that, guys? You have any thoughts?
I think China. Yeah, I think it would be fair to say China has a bourgeoisie now. But I think that it's also important to understand that, this is a relatively recent thing. Like even when you know, it's much more conditional than you know, these people's rights are a lot more restricted than what you find in the West, right? Most of the major industries, like tech, it's interesting that Jack Ma's so wealthy, right? Because tech was like the big exception in terms of major industries that weren't under the thumb of public control, right? In other words, we're not national, right?
Okay.
You know, like aviation, tobacco, I mean, all kinds of things, right? Big money industries. So usually, right, the private sector is used as, you know, for things which are smaller, right? You know, kinds of businesses and enterprises which are smaller. So it's not surprising that what you get, and by the way, even with something like Huawei, which is like ostensibly private, it's not even clear to what extent their nominally private status is not connected with the desire of the Chinese Communist Party to conceal or downplay the degree to which they actually function as like an arm of the public sector, right? So yes, China has, but that having been said, of course, China has a lot of wealthy people. So I don't want to trivialize that. I think probably overall, like if you look at Deng's work, probably the greatest weakness of it is the way that he maybe elides certain questions of class struggle, like in his tireless emphasizing of the development of the productive forces. But I also think it's important to understand when he was writing versus now, right? Because someone's writing here like China has 1,058 billionaires. It's like, well, they didn't have 1,058 billionaires when Deng was writing.
Yeah.
Right. So I think what you can say is like, if we're talking about the principal contradiction, I think one can argue that class struggle becomes, you know, I'm not going to say the principal contradiction. I have to think about it more, but it becomes certainly more important, more principal.
Yeah,
right?
yeah. I think that, so, you know, superficially, we can make the claim that, you know, there are still rich people, right? And so on. But I think that's more a structural, you know, effect more than anything else. If we want to really analyze whether China actually represents a kind of socialist society, I think it'd be better, and I don't have the data for this kind of analysis right now, but I can certainly allude to something Elliot posted, I think yesterday on the group. It's that, you know, the urban planning, right? I don't know if you guys, I mean, if you've been to the south of the United States, right, or to Mexico, anywhere, but it is poor, right? It is. I mean, the planning is poor, right? It's shameful even. And Elliot recently made a post in the group, showcasing some of the public housing that the government actually develops. And something that I found very interesting is that we don't usually get a lot of, you know, public housing like the projects in the United States or in the Soviet Union. Instead, in Mexico, what has been the norm lately, you know, for the past decade, 2 decades, is this houses built by the Infonavit, which they seek a partnership with the actual national bourgeoisie, you know, with constructors, right? And they buy land, right? They develop it, and they build incredibly shitty houses, like terribly shitty houses, you know, and they are all like allotted to, in a corner of the city, you know, kind of like suburbia, but worse, right?
Yeah,
because they're like boxed in and walled out, and that has been going on for decades, right? And now when you think about socialist public housing, I mean socialist, you know, social public housing, what you get is this image. And what it really is the image of, you know, of corporativism, of capitalism, not the image of actual, you know, social interests at play. And when you look at the infrastructure being developed in China, again, I don't want to simplify. I'm sure that there are cases where things like this are also happening there. Nevertheless, they develop the kind of infrastructure that you just don't see here in Mexico or in the United States.
Yeah, I mean, and it's interesting to talk about the South, by the way, because a lot of the South, you know, the private sector, you know, it's kind of ironic with the South because you have all these politicians who are like Republicans who rail against, you know, big government, you know, but the reality is, right, that if you look at like the 2 best presidents for the South, as far as I'm concerned, were like Lincoln and Roosevelt, right? Like Lincoln in the sense that he liberated the slaves, who were like the majority of the population in some states. So how can you not say that's good for the South, right? But it is true that there was like a lot of economic damage affected. I mean, like even you know, liberating the slaves was a huge liquidation of capital, we could say. You know, and there was a, you know, it was hugely underdeveloped. like, as a consequence of that. You had an agricultural economy that couldn't function profitably in the way it had before, but wasn't thoroughly industrialized, right? But it was really Roosevelt, right, and the New Deal, right, that really raised the South up to the level where it had this boom where you had people from the North moving there. Now, the irony is, again, the attempt to frame the history of the South as being like, the government's always been against us and all this. It's like, look at like NASA and Houston, all these kind of things, right? They're public projects that really got the economy of the South going, which is why until the Civil Rights Act, white Democrats supported Roosevelt. Now, I want to tie this in a little bit with China. Actually, Alfred Son Rethel, an intellectual in manual labor, which I won't dwell on the details of, but he critiques, sort of the structures of abstract thought as they've developed, which he attributes to the structure of the commodity form, and he calls for, I think, somewhat naive, but in any case, return to praxis, right? But it's just interesting at the end of the book because he singles out. He's very critical of the Soviet Union, but he singles out two projects for him as being like, reflective of the kind of the changing of the relationship between man and nature, so that it's not governed by these kind of abstract formulas that derive from commodity exchange. And the two he singles out are one, like the afforestation projects in China pursued by the communist government. There are big problems with that historically in China, if you read, with afforestation and how it affects crops and everything, or with deforestation, how it affects crops, rather. And the second is the Tennessee Valley River Authority in the United States. Here's something important to remember, right? When it comes to China, and I will say this in their defense, when it comes to China, of course, the United States, like the world imperialist hegemon and all of this, but when it comes to them adopting a somewhat less hostile posture, I think it's mostly driven by geopolitical imperatives. But it is important to remember that American society in like 71, when there was this rapprochement with Nixon, was very, very different from American society. If you go back to like the Russian Revolution, right? Because like you'd begun to have like the working class really influencing like from Roosevelt onward, right, the structures of political power in the United States, right? So I'm not saying America was ever like, it was always a pretty awful imperialist country. But I guess what I mean is sometimes I think it's also like, I'm not anarchistic, but I do think sometimes if we talk about this category of like tankies, I think whatever this means, right? Most of the Marxist tradition, whatever. I think sometimes people online, sometimes they do make a mistake in that they don't see the good, like, if a country is like, just like labeled like, oh, that's capitalist, right? They don't take account for all the diverse elements that are at play within it, right? Like the kind of influence that the working class is exercising within that context, and looking at what good has been done and saying, well, it's actually good, right? Now we're not saying the whole thing is good, right? But there are because the working class, it's not like you just get a state and that's how it works, right? It's like there's a working class in every country. There's popular uprisings in every country, right? And they have the capacity to affect good in all those contexts. So all of that deserves to be examined, and there's no magical moment where you're like, oh, we're socialist. Right. All of these things are based on the particular context and the particular struggles. Right. So that's what I would say. I wouldn't, I don't think you can ever draw a hard line. I think you have to look at the particular economic tensions within any context. Right. What do you guys think of that?
Well, I think it's fair. It's a fair. I agree with you, Conrad.
Okay. Just glad to elicit agreement. Did you want to move on to the third principle then?
Yeah, sure. He says, third, we must uphold the leadership of the Communist Party, and actually mentions a movement at Tiananmen Square. It's definitely not the same movement.
Yeah.
And he talks about the position that the Communist Party has played in the advancement of China. I don't really buy that argument, right? Because here in Mexico we had a very similar position by the PRI. We had our own Communist Party, that also led Mexico in the road of modernization. And if anybody was saying, oh, because they did it in the past, But here, what they're saying instead, it's that, again, as you say, we have to see things in their context, right? And the context of China is that actually, the Chinese Communist Party is the one that was responsible for the development, and there are also no actual alternatives, right? No actual popular alternatives. one of the reasons why that is responsibility of the Chinese Communist Party, definitely. But on the other hand, there, I guess it's just an appeal to a certain pragmatism, right? If you want to certainly develop the country in the direction that we say that we should go, you should adhere to the party. But I don't know. Here, it's hard not to be always doing a call, to a party, but without it, and I think when Deng talks about also being an example and so on, you have to consolidate into a movement, right? You can't just be, again, as you were saying, a highly individualistic actor, right? Running on, on individualist politics, anarchist politics, and so on. I do think that we should be working as a party, but I think that it should be specific. It should be a choice, that people should make specific to their country, right? To the local politics specifically, because, for example, the president's party Morena has great candidates in certain states in Mexico, and in others it has terrible candidates, and we can't tell people, align with Morena. Rather, do what you believe is right.
Yeah. Well, and this is why I don't. I think I'm actually translating an introduction to the Communist Manifesto by Palmiro Togliatti right now. The first draft is done. But one thing he says is that, you have to be one stride ahead of the popular movement, but not too far ahead. Right. And
not too far ahead. Yeah, definitely.
And that's one thing that's one thing that, I think, like, that's why I will say in the United States, like, I support at least in theory, as I say, because I think there's a lot of problems. I support this like democratic socialist, kind of idea, because I think that's where the mass line sort of is. Now, I do see now that I think there's more opportunity for a divergence and for a shift left, right? But again, like, historically, we forget, like, where did the Bolsheviks come from? They came from the Mensheviks, right? Where did the Chinese communists come from? They came from the nationalists, right? We can go on and on. And really, if you look at most radical parties, you had to have that change, right, towards the thinking of socialism before you could have a more radical alternative emerge. So I think it's very, very important to approach these questions strategically, right? And it's always very nuanced. As for the uprising you were talking about, that was in the late 70s. And that was one thing Deng struggled with a great deal throughout his leadership was the contradiction between the stress on opening up that he embraced and the sort of like insistence on the maintenance of the integrity of the rule of the Chinese Communist Party and all that. So this later came to a head in Tiananmen Square, as you know, which we'll get to eventually. And it was a very grisly and violent episode. But quite uncharacteristic for China outside of a wartime context, outside of the Civil War context, because again, like it's not, if you look at people who died in the Great Leap Forward, it was like failed agricultural reforms. There's really, as far as I know, there's really not a whole lot of cases of like, massacres or these kind of things happening in peacetime, right? Within China. As we know, even, officials who are arrested, right? Often, more often than not, they survived.
I don't know, Conrad. I mean, I'll give you an example. Here in Mexico, I don't want to, say it's the same thing in both countries, but you certainly don't hear about our activists being murdered every week, right? But nevertheless, it's happening. And sometimes there are cases where even entire groups of activists, 10, 20, 30 people have been rounded up, sometimes by the army, and liquidated here in Mexico, right? I don't know, last year or the year before that, right? There was this case of Ayotzinapa, right? Of teachers who were organizing for something, and whatever it is they wanted to do, it's, and as Wiggins says, it happens a lot in Colombia, right? And I would certainly, say it happens in China, and we just don't know about it.
Yeah. I mean, I'm talking about mass violence of that sort. I don't mean to suggest that people aren't like, secretly, imprisoned or anything like that. I just mean something very splashy and visible like that.
Right. Yeah. We had, again, I think each country has its examples, right? Mexico had Tlatelolco in way before, like by this point, Tlatelolco had already happened, right? And the United States had Kent State, which I'm not sure what year was it. I think around the 80s also.
With Kent State.
Yeah,
Oh, that was with Nixon. So that was in the 60s, if I remember.
the 60s also. Yeah.
I think
Okay.
it was the 60s.
Yeah.
Or it was like 70. It was around the Vietnam War.
Looks like it was May 4, 1970, apparently.
Okay.
But yeah, my point is that it's not. I'm just saying that these things happen, and they happen in all countries, and the actual reason why while they're happening is that Tlatelolco was our bloody failed May 68. Yeah, of course, exactly it was. But what we have to learn is that this isn't the case of country bad, right? But rather, it's the case of having a bourgeois national government. And even if we had a proletarian national government, the same thing could happen because we had a government, right? It's a thing that's going to keep on happening. And when we are in the positions of power, so to say, we're going to have to be responsible for it in the sense that it could happen even without our intention, right? This is the kinds of things that are contingent to running a country, right? And what we have to do is we have to learn about them. We have to learn about them to try not to let them happen again.
Yeah, no, obviously when you talk about someone like Mao, the temptation, because he's often, characterized, right, if you look at like Zheng Cheng, Unknown Story, as like the worst murder of the 20th century, and I think these things are quite hyperbolic, the temptation is to look and to compare the actual history with someone like Stalin or something, and then I think you can say, well, it wasn't so violent, but of course it's relative, and I don't mean to downplay the fact that these things happen, right? I'm just saying that I don't think even by third world standards and considering its population, I wouldn't characterize China as a particularly morbid state in peacetime.
Definitely. No, that's my point. My point is even if these things were happening, it's shamefully the standard, for the third world. Like this is a systemic issue around everywhere, not just in China. Even like the eating of wild animals, The rat soup it's a thing here in Mexico, right?
Yeah.
We don't make we make jokes about it every now and then, but it's just systemic, right? People have to eat rats sometimes because that's what's available in their region, and it sucks. It's terrible, but it's not because it's Mexico.
I think a lot of it just has to do with like, the, what it means to establish sovereignty and to establish a government that's capable of, creating economic outcomes, right? And the West already went through its very violent, convulsions and upheavals, right? In many cases earlier. Right, it did happen. Right, go to the American Revolution, go to the French Revolution. Right, these things happen. Or we can talk about primitive accumulation for that matter. Right, but I mean, for countries which are experiencing these things later, right, you're seeing that process of consolidation happen in front of our eyes. Right, and but the thing is, it was never nice. Right, when the West did it, it wasn't nice. The West likes to pretend that never happened. Right, we're champions of human rights, right? It's a question of stages, and I don't think there's any way to get that out of the third world totally. But I think the best thing you can do is just try to minimize it and try to deal with it case by case and reduce violence against activists and all that kind of thing, right? These are, as you said, these are structural economic issues, structural political issues, right? It's like because I want to condemn it, but I also don't want to pivot toward this like kind of voluntaristic Western stance of like, oh, that's just because he's crazy.
Yeah,
you know what I mean? Like that's like, so it's not about condoning it; it's just about seeing it as a structural issue. Right?
Yeah.
I just wanted to go, and I wanted to mention here too. We'll move on to the fourth principle, but I just want to mention here too, with regard to what I was saying. I found this interesting in the later readings. Deng says that in Yunnan, Mao put forward the principle of killing none and arresting few. So I think this is interesting, right? Because I didn't know that this was actually articulated as like a clear policy, right? But I think probably it was, so this would have been, after Stalin had ascended in power in Russia, I think he was already demarcating, right, what he was trying to accomplish, right, from the more morbid Soviet context in his own way, right? So again, it's not about saying like they had terrible rectification campaigns and persecutions and all kinds of things. There were, I read that there was like a village of like 1,600 people that was massacred, including children, like by the communists in this time. I don't mean to present it as all like it was all nice, but I'm comparing it to these like what happens in a lot of the third world, certainly the Stalinist violence, and so on. Shall we move on to the fourth principle, by the way?
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah. Deng says, fourth, we must uphold Marxism, Leninism, and Mao Zedong thought. One of the key points of our struggle against Lin Biao and the Gang of Four was opposition to the falsification, doctoring, and fragmenting of Marxism, Leninism, and Mao Zedong thought. Since the smashing of the gang, we have restored the scientific character of Marxism, Leninism, and Mao Zedong thought and have guided ourselves by them. This is a resounding victory for the whole party and people, but a few individuals think otherwise. Either they openly oppose the basic tenets of Marxism-Leninism, or else they uphold Marxism-Leninism in word only while indeed opposing Mao Zedong thought, which represents the integration of the universal truth of Marxism-Leninism with the practice of the Chinese Revolution. We must uphold these erroneous trends of thought. Some comrades say that we should uphold correct Mao Zedong thought, but not erroneous Mao Zedong thought. This kind of statement is also wrong. What we consistently take as our guide to action are the basic tenets of Marxism-Leninism and Mao Zedong thought, or, to put it another way, the scientific system formed by these tenets. When it comes to individual theses, neither Marx and Lenin nor Comrade Mao could be immune from misjudgments of one sort or another. But these do not belong to the scientific system formed by the basic tenets of Marxism-Leninism and Mao Zedong thought. Then he goes to talk at length. Again, he says that. And now I want to talk at some length about Mao Zedong thought. It's a couple of paragraphs, but maybe do you have any comments on the first part that I just read?
No. Go ahead. If you want to read something, go ahead.
Yeah. I'll keep reading. He says, now I want to talk at some length about Mao Zedong thought. China's anti-imperialist and anti-feudal revolution went through innumerable cruel defeats. Was it not Mao Zedong thought which enabled the Chinese people, about a quarter of the world's population, to find the correct road for the revolution, achieve nationwide liberation in 1949, and basically accomplish socialist transformation by 1956? This succession of splendid victories changed not only China's destiny, but the world's situation as well. From the international point of view, Mao Zedong thought is inseparably linked with the struggle against hegemonism, and the practice of hegemonism under the banner of socialism is a most obvious betrayal of socialist principles on the part of a Marxist-Leninist party after it has come to power. Which, Conrad, this thing of this critique, right, of Soviet hegemonism.
Yeah.
Right? As I have already mentioned, in the evening of his life, Comrade Mao Zedong formulated the strategy of differentiating the three worlds and personally ushered in a new stage in Sino-American and Sino-Japanese relations. By so doing, he created new conditions for the development of the worldwide struggle against hegemonism and for the future of world politics. While conducting our modernization program in the present international environment, we cannot help recalling Comrade Mao's contributions. I want to skip the couple of next paragraphs. I highlighted something that I think is worth pointing out, especially with what you were saying, Conrad, about the Gotha program, right? He says the case of Karl Marx was similar. In his estimation of Marx, Friedrich Engels said that it was only thanks to Marx that the contemporary proletariat became conscious for the first time of its own position and demands and of the conditions necessary for its own liberation. Does this mean that history is made by any one individual? History is made by the people, but this does not preclude the people from respecting an outstanding individual. Of course, this respect must not turn into blind worship. No man should be looked upon as a demigod.
Yeah. And that's a consistent refrain, right, of Deng's thought. But again, it shows you, I think, the basic contradiction of the fact that, it's there was a Chinese guy in my master's who I'm friends with, Tiger Liu, who posted in our group sometimes, and he gave a presentation at Kingston University about the need to repoliticize Chinese philosophy, because he said often it's treated as this fairly banal sort of academic discourse. It's presented in sort of nondescript historical terms, and I agreed with his thesis in some ways, but I also just sought to complement it, because in a way, you could say, well, in China, philosophy is depoliticized. You could also say it's an intensely philosophical state, in the sense that, there's this philosophic streak, right? Or it is a sort of philosophy that animates the Chinese Communist Party, right? That projects these goals that are like way beyond, the current situation, right? Which is sort of the telos of Marxism. We abolish the value form and all this. But in a way, it's like what Hegel says in the Phenomenology of Spirit. When you have this sort of feudal context, like he's talking about France, right, in the Revolution, and when reason sort of ascends to the throne of power, it functions as a kind of like absolute violence, right? So there's a tension between like the contents, or there's a tension between the spirit, right, of this notion of reason, and the the drastic manner in which it imposes itself, that betrays the feudal context, right, in those sort of settings, right? And I think you can draw on the analogy. I think is valid to the extent that France was, like a sort of feudal country, right, prior to the revolution, right, just as China was a feudal country prior to its revolution, right?
Right.
And so this becomes a tension, right? You see, because like Deng's like, yeah, we need to like not just sort of like treat, deify, right? We need to be critical, but then he's like, but here's the limit. Right. And that's what I was saying, that I think that contradiction inadvertently ended up inspiring, the big character posters, the uprisings that happened in the late 70s and later Tiananmen Square, tragically. Right. And it showed like a certain capacity to square these things. Right.
He actually mentions this next page. He says, moreover, they have raised such sensational slogans. He's talking here. So he asks himself, is the Central Committee making a mountain out of a molehill when it takes this view of the matter? No, it is not. In the light of current developments, the party has no choice. And he talks about people, provoking, other people, hoodwinking them. So he says, they have raised such sensational slogans as oppose hunger and give us human rights, inciting people to hold demonstrations and deliberately trying to get foreigners to give worldwide publicity to their words and deeds. There is a so-called China Human Rights Group, which has gone so far as to put up big character posters requesting the President of the United States to show concern for human rights in China. Can we permit such an open call for intervention in China's internal affairs? There is also a so-called Thaw Society, which has issued a declaration openly opposing the dictatorship of the proletariat on the ground that it divides mankind. Can we tolerate this kind of freedom of speech, which flagrantly contravenes the principles of our constitution? This reminded me a lot, I think isn't the anniversary coming up for the Pearson debate, when he says that, Marx divided people into two big camps, the workers and Jesus. Yeah. See, it's still happening.
No, those are those are all relevant things. And so Deng was in sort of a precarious position, right, in terms of trying to balance these different injunctions. And I think he understood strategically, the advantages that would yield, politically and economically, right? But I think there are competing ideological gestures, which I think he never can fully, satisfactorily, marry together or sort of resolve, right? And I think it becomes a problem. I want to just point out here, someone raised a question. What is your take on the Maoist movements in Nepal, the Philippines, Peru, India, Naxalites, etc.? Once in power, will they apply Deng Xiaoping's economic principles? What's interesting about these movements, if you look at them, and I wouldn't purport to be an expert, though I have read a little bit about them. I mean, the movement in Nepal, I guess you're talking about the dissident movement, because the Nepalese Maoists actually became part of the government. In the Philippines, there's an ongoing civil war, which I know Duterte or whatever, has been quite brutal in that. Peru, Shining Path was very strong. India, but in a lot of these countries, in any case, just to generalize, these movements have remained, not Nepal so much, but these movements have remained somewhat in like an agrarian context, where there are sort of like peasant movements that are fighting in the countryside. And I think that it makes sense in that context that they've never, a lot of these places will say like, we avow fidelity to Mao Zedong thought, not Deng Xiaoping thought. right? And I think that makes perfect sense, considering their context.
Yeah.
Right. I think for a lot of them, they haven't really conceived what it would mean to like actually run like a national government with highly urbanized areas and industry and everything, which put Mao along a different path as well, right?
Yeah, here in Mexico, we have an analog with the Zapatistas, right? And as you say, it's the national context that gives people its name, right? If we hadn't had a General Emiliano Zapata, maybe we would have Maoists, right?
Yeah.
Or, another Mexican revolutionary, whatever. But my point is that we had a Mexican revolutionary that actually, adhered to, left-wing libertarian principles.
Yeah.
And that inspired a whole movement afterwards.
Yeah, well, of course, I knew about this. I've known about this for some time because I was a Rage Against the Machine fan when I was a.
They brought a lot of attention to it, right? To NAFTA and so on.
Yeah, great. Very like obviously like Rage Against the Machine. Very much, very stuck in like a '90s kind of mode of activism. But still, I think remarkably progressive given the climate.
Yeah.
In general,
I'm thankful.
Yeah, impressive, and just kind of strange. I love when the video when Zach De La Rocha interviews Noam Chomsky because it's just like, I love it because he's just like, you can see he's just so happy to talk to him, and he's trying very hard to phrase his questions in like the most intelligent way possible, which is hard when you're a rock star. It's very difficult to do that, but I think he does as impressive a job as he could. But yeah, I was supposed to see them in Paris, but COVID. Anyway. So we can move on, but I want to. So we let's maybe move off the four cardinal principles. We spent some time. Let's move on, and I just want to. We're moving on to this interview, right? Let's get into that. We can develop a market economy under socialism. I think we're really getting to some of the core tensions.
Before we go into that, I just wanted to quote Deng on something that I think this never made it out of this text or something, but he says, "I also suggest that the authors of really good books and articles be awarded monetary prizes by the party and government, so that the work in this sphere, which is seemingly routine but actually very demanding, is given due recognition." You just want to point that out. Yeah.
Well, I think he was well liked by cultural producers. He offered a lot of support for it. But again, it's always couched in certain limitations. I mean, later I think in the essays he complains about like filthy, pornographic, vulgar material being like imported in the West and having like a affecting like spiritual degeneracy or something like this. So again, like it's he did support art, but this shows you also, I said, the problem with the Deng era is that it set on social energies that it was unable to completely contain. Right. And insofar as it did succeed in containing it, it was only because of like boundless economic growth. Right. But the contradictions still persist in the society, right, in that respect. But I want to move forward here just to this interview. We can develop a market economy under socialism. By the way, Timothy, if you have anything to add or say, don't need to.
I'm finding the talk about the third world interesting. I'm just not as educated on the topic, so I'm not going to pretend to be able to keep up. But one thing, because I know this comes up later, and we like our list, there's at the end of the upload, the 3 don'ts, which are: don't pick on others for their faults, don't put labels on people, and don't use a big stick. Because I know that it either comes up in the interview or the one after the interview. But just wanted to.
Well, yeah, and that's the basic tension between Deng, which runs through like pretty much every sentence of Deng. Where Deng, he's like lists don't really like work to describe things. Like it's kind of like feudalism, and he's like, here's a list. Like, I mean, and I get it. Like I get what he's doing. Like, and it's all quite dialectical. But it's like I think in terms of just like. I think you have like I don't want to like mystify his work too much, but I think you really have to be thinking like in a very dialectical way to try to understand what he's doing. And because it's really, really bound up with like the limitations of the social context, right? If you just take it on like an abstract, rational way, often it seems blatantly contradictory.
Yeah, I think it's I think just from my reading, he definitely seems to be thinking, and like at the end of the preface of the Phenomenology of Spirit, there's the comparison between the accent and the meter with the predicate and the subject. Yeah. So like so you can kind of see even a certain thing, like you have the list, you could even call that like the accent, and then there's the meter that follows it that gives the context to it, and then you have another one, and there's a period of reflection, and you can move in an organic whole, and you do have these documents that sit around, but they are produced in a moving system, not just some absolute abstract point.
Well, to be too schematic, like for Hegel, the truth of sort of phrases, it's not the subject or the predicate, it's like the copula, right? So it's in the link, right? So like, if Deng says like, to give you an example, right? If he says like, well, lists are like sort of feudalism, right? Like here's a list, right? Like, that there's a linkage, right? There that's very, very important to understand, because what he's also saying is like, I'm giving you a list because we're in feudalism, right? Like, or because we have feudal. That's why I'm giving you a list. I don't think this is like the be all and end all, right? I'm saying if you extricate his work from that kind of context, and he's obviously quite educated in these fields, if you extricate his work from that context, I think it can become incomprehensible. And I think that almost creates its own problem, because it's possible that his work functions at a level of dialectical density that, already was undialectical in terms of overestimating the capacity of people to like, when he says one thing and, like when he's like, oh, well, we need to have, individualism and expression, but this is the historical situation and these are the imperatives, right? It's actually asking a lot from the reader, right? To try to get it, like it requires a certain understanding of history, economy, politics. It's asking a lot. He's not saying do this or don't, right? And the people who are, who are the most sort of vigilantist Maoist, right, voluntarist, in the Cultural Revolution, they tended to be more that way, like do this. Right. Now I'm not saying the results they engendered were positive. They did get results. Deng attempts, I think, a much more delicate balancing gesture, right, throughout much of his work. But we should move on here. We can develop a market economy under socialism. Just one paragraph that I think is like maybe the most important paragraph that I've read so far. One of them, very, very important. So I'm going to read it. Deng says here, it is wrong to maintain that a market economy exists only in capitalist society and that there is only capitalist market economy. Why can't we develop a market economy under socialism? Developing a market economy does not mean practicing capitalism. While maintaining a planned economy as the mainstay of our economic system, we are also introducing a market economy. But it is a socialist market economy. Although a socialist market economy is similar to a capitalist one in method, there are also differences between them. The socialist market economy mainly regulates interrelations between state-owned enterprises, between collectively owned enterprises, and even between foreign capitalist enterprises. But in the final analysis, this is all done under socialism in a socialist society. We cannot say that market economy exists only under capitalism. Market economy was in its embryonic stages as early as feudalist society. And by the way, some Marx scholars would set it further, like much further back than that, right? But that's an uncontroversial take. China is supposed to even add elements of manufacturing capital in like the Song dynasty, which would be interesting.
Isn't that BC?
No, that's 10. No, maybe there's another one, but it's 1011 AD is what I'm thinking.
Okay.
We can surely develop it under socialism. Similarly, taking advantage of the useful aspects of capitalist countries, including their methods of operation and management, does not mean that we will adopt capitalism. Instead, we use those methods in order to develop the productive forces under socialism. As long as learning from capitalism is regarded as no more than a means to an end, it will not change the structure of socialism or bring China back to capitalism. Very significant, as long as learning from capitalism is regarded as no more than a means to an end. But this is really interesting, right? Because again, it gets into this, if we want to get to a big difference, I think, in, more of an anarchistic conception of Marx's work, I think one thing is a lot of it, the subtleties of the argument hinge a lot on perceptions of the commodity form, right? So a lot of people who are loved by people who have more of the anarchistic reading, they really downplay the significance of the commodity form prior to capitalism, right? They're kind of like, well, that sort of existed, but it didn't do anything, right? Whereas I think people who have a more favorable view, people at a certain level of theoretical sophistication who have a more favorable view of actually existing socialist states, they tend to stress the way that the commodity form is a more transhistorical feature of societies. Now, Marx at one point says the commodity form is 10,000 years old, right? There's all kinds of contradictory statements because the problem is you can't say it begins here and there, right? He's talking about the capacity to have the transference of property, money. I mean, you can go back to indigenous groups trading things for seashells and say, well, that's you can say, well, that's a certain mild instantiation of it, right? But because the point is that all these things are happening in a context where the society is not organized based around the injunction of valorized capital, right? So if we're just talking about, the principles of exchange and of commodities, there's so many different manifestations of that, right? Nevertheless, we can see in more recent stages of history that there's been, even prior to capitalism, a general escalation. Marx in the third volume of Capital refers to the Roman slave owning economy as having had capital, right? Sometimes the words primitive capital are used by this for commentators. In the feudal system, you have the Borgs, right, which developed, and the cities become repositories of capital. Again, I was mentioning China and the Song Dynasty. So, but Deng's point here, I put up the quote in the group of Ernest Mandel to contrast it, writing in 1976, just 3 years before Deng, and it's his introduction to the first volume of Capital in English, which should be read because it's a great, wonderful introduction. And in it, Mandel, he says basically, like, if you realize that the commodity form doesn't just come into existence with capitalism, what you'll realize is that it's not going to be like abolished overnight, right? That there actually will be commodity production, commodity exchange, right, in socialist economies, right, or transitional economies, right? Because how would you get rid of it? Like again, we joked earlier about abolishing money, right? You abolish money, like, how are you going to do that, right? I mean, there's elements of society. I'm not saying like even major industries, but there's elements of society, though the commodity form ultimately affects all this stuff. But there are areas of society that are very hard to publicly run and regulate, right, based on models available to us. It's also very hard to envision what how economic structures would function without something like money, right? Now, that doesn't mean the society has to be organized around the valorization of capital, of course. But I will say this. As regards Deng, I think it's the question of China today, right? China has succeeded so much, right, in this campaign. There's still ways to go, but they've succeeded a lot, right, in this campaign to develop the productive forces, this kind of socialist market economy model that Deng has proposed, to the point now where you have people who are so wealthy, right, that the question it really raises is, can the Chinese Communist Party, is it or can it continue to function, right? Or like to say, not to say it is this way today, but is it this way today, or could it continue to function in such a way that it actually manages to, maintain these capital controls and put checks, right, on the control that capital is able to exert over the society, right? Which I think is the big problem of China today, right? It's like, which is why it's so ambiguous. I mean, we had a poll in our group, we said, like, is China a socialist commodity economy or is it capitalist? 45 people voted. Yeah, okay, but, and I appreciate that. And I think it owes to the Chinese system, but let's not pretend that poverty alleviation is strictly a socialist.
Capitalism has also been pretty good at getting rid of some poverty.
Some poverty, yeah. Well, a lot of.
I just mean in the sense, like, if we go from like feudalism today. I mean, it's just emphasizing the fact that generally increasing the productive forces has these consequences. Though China, it's been much more well distributed, where in the West, it explicitly posited and self-understood as capitalist countries.
Presupposing. I think the problem with saying that capitalism does that, which I really think you have to be conscious of, is if you look at what has caused capitalism to function for people, it's always been like contingent upon popular movements that have, forced redistribution, right? That don't necessarily issue from the bourgeois itself. So I just would be a little careful about saying that it's capitalism. I'm not saying you're wrong, but
I mean, it's a fair point.
And because that's like what, that's what like right-wing politicians always do. They're like, look at the equality we've created here. It's like people on your side were against all that. You're taking credit for it now. But I just mean to say about this whole issue of the big question I think in China today, like we had this poll and 45 people said it's a socialist commodity economy in our group, which does a lot of research on this. I think quite somewhat sympathetic research. We had 37 people say it's capitalist, right? So it shows you, and I don't think that's just so out of touch or anything. I think it shows you like the basic, ambiguity of the fluidity and ambiguity of the situation.
I think I'm still working on it, but I'm starting to develop an idea of that the really important thing in my mind, in the first chapter of Capital, that when you can start to talk about like certain periods of commodity production, is that at the end, it's the fetish that posits all the previous stages as its moments. Like if you're going to do kind of the Hegelian movement there, that's what you get at the end. So if at the end you don't arrive at the fetish, but there's another or a development later on beyond the fetish that can then take care of that and empties that out of its substantiality, then you could talk about a commodity production outside of the capitalist fetishistic context. And something.
Yeah, well, and I think it also gives us a new way to think of like, because like you often have this issue in Marxist philosophy where it's like, you know, like people often mock Lukács for like this like idea of like a proletarian subject object, you know, like, oh, we'll get beyond capitalism, and you know, then, and I actually I'm going to self-critique a little bit because I think sometimes I've been guilty of this. We'll get beyond capitalism, and then, you know, I think sometimes the problem is that we use the term capitalism synonymously with the commodity form. Like, I would be willing to accept, like, the notion that social relations could be transformed in ways that are totally unimaginable, right? To the point where negativity, as we conceive it, might not exist, provided we were talking about something subtler than just the capitalist mode of production as we know it, right? Because it's very common in Marxism to say, get rid of capitalism. And that's really the question. Are we talking about capitalism, or are we talking about the commodity form?
Mm-hmm. Right. Because there is a real issue of like when you're going to talk about like property, like there's property in the sense of this is my thing, but there's also in the sense of the property in a more metaphysical sense. Like this belongs to something else. Like I think those two things are definitely linked. And you see that conflation like in the phenomenology, it happens towards the end of the reason section. But how do you talk about something being of something else without or is that a property relation, or what happens when you eventually get rid of it, or can you get rid of it? And I don't think that conversation is being had at all. Like in Lukács, there's, you know, I feel like there's some traces of it, but normally it's like a lot of Marxist discourse doesn't deal with the actual like metaphysical difficulties of the things that they imply, but then don't actually want to explore.
Yeah, and I think also because it's like impossible to do it at a certain level, but one could do it better or worse. I mean, just to say, you have to separate out like, you know, the genesis of commodity relations, which permit things like property transference, and capitalism. And those are both very significant, but they're not the same thing, right? And it creates this periodization problem that is a big issue as I see it in left discourse. Like, look at this like Anthropocene stuff. People are like, oh, the Anthropocene began when like humans created fire. You know, and it's like, well, I'm pretty sure carbon emissions didn't start rising in any substantial way till like, you know, the invention of the steam engine, like, you know, 150 years ago or whatever. So, you know, Marx differentiates between alienation and objectification, right? The instrumentalization of the instrumentalization of nature, right? Which is, you know, in some sense a biological attribute, and you know, the sense of, you know, in his earlier work, estrangement from one's labor. In the later work, it's more economically conceived, but whatever, right? The point is that he has, I like that because it's a good example of where he uses separate categories. But I think we have to be very careful. I don't like personally when people, I've said this before, I don't like when people just like, I think, you know, maybe this is going against the grain of how these terms are used, but I think it's very important to think imperialism as something different from just colonialism. Right? I said that, right? Like not to conflate, you know, the British in, you know, or the Belgians in the Congo with the Ottoman Empire or the Chinese Empire, you know, which I'm not saying were great, right? That's not the point. But I just don't think that, I don't think like pre-capitalist, you know, tributary, you know, extraction is like the same thing as, you know, millions of people being killed in these campaigns that, you know, gave a model, you know, for what the Nazis did in Europe, really. So, you know, it's I just think we really have to be careful with this. And I think we really have, because I think we so often in left discourse, we just flatten these things together.
This is maybe the philosophy brain talking, but like if things occur at different places and times, they're different.
Yeah.
I mean, like if they're the same thing, they happen at the same time and same place. The fact that there is a difference in those two determinations means that there's something else going on. I mean, it's very simple, but I mean, you know, if you deny that, then you have to. I think there, if you want to deny that or say that, oh, these things are really the same, even though it's all this, and you don't actually want to go through the labor of finding the identity or the, you know, the lines that how you get from like the Achaemenid and Persian Empire to, say, I don't know, the Congo, the race for Africa or something like that. And like obviously things are connected, but it takes what 2,250 or something like that, 2,000-ish years to actually get to that point.
And the sense of linearity is only a retroactive, you know, construction. That's the other thing, that like we read all of history. To talk about the commodity forum is also to read history retroactively from the standpoint of capitalism. You know, it has validity at this point, but I just want to stress that I don't think, you know, the fact that even like the movement toward capitalism didn't occur in some linear, like the feudal age in many respects can be seen, you know, up to a point as a regression. Like I said, you know, in China, you had like this manufacturing capital breakthrough, but there was no demand, so it just collapsed.
Oh yeah, this is just the retroactive teleological judgment stuff that just, you know, just is kind of just happens when you give a narrative.
Yeah, you see it here a lot in Mexico when people say that, oh, Andrés Manuel is gonna turn the country into Venezuela. You know, you hear I think the analog in the United States was Bernie Sanders, right? They were saying that Sanders wasn't want to turn, right? And I will always just ask whoever person, like, do you think the United States is going to embargo Mexico, or, you know, like, how do you think it's going to happen? And, you know, of course, it's like, well, I don't know, right?
Yeah, and it was, you know,
just a bunch of abstractions.
It's just, you know, and that's what, you know, it's like, that's what I think the problem in a way is like, you know, that's the necessity of dialectical thought and dialectical materialism. It's like, if you look at, if I can say the DM word, if you look at, you know, because I feel like a lot of, like, if you look at the emergence of what I would characterize as leftist thought, I would say is it was like the strategic postulation of abstractions as a way of envisioning a world beyond the one we inhabit, right? And as kind of, you know, functioning as a vector of struggle. And I think that what dialectical materialism does, it maintains that, but it also offers a much more detailed and sort of sober analysis of that. So it also functions as a critique of abstraction, right? And I think, you know, in general, like, you know, the strength of the scientificity of dialectical thought was really weakened after the fall of the Soviet Union globally. You know, in terms of these sort of like utopian, you know, currents like coming back and everything. I'm not saying everything like the USSR did was great intellectually, but just as a general heuristic.
Oh, it's certainly on a rise. Like, look at American politics. We're somehow trying to redo like an even worse version of the SDS in the 2021.
Yeah. I just want to 1 second. What do you think of the cultural difference between European and Chinese Marxism? Can European or Western Marxist thinking be applied to China? I mean, it's not really about Europe or China. It's about like the mode of production. You know, you'll find some more of this or more of that in different regions. I mean, I would think like Maoist ideas would be to some extent applicable in any country that was like agricultural and largely non-urbanized, you know, sort of trying to organize guerrilla struggles and stuff, right? You know, just as I don't think that that's a strategy that would be applicable to another place. Actually, I just posted in the group about this, right? Because Deng, in some of the later writings I went through, he said like, look, we can't really lecture other countries about how they pursue Marxism unless they're like aggressing us or something, because every country's fucking different, and we did it in a different way in the Soviet Union, and it shouldn't be like, oh, you're not doing it like us, or oh, you're not doing it like the Soviet Union, right? It's like, you know, he was talking about, you mentioned Eurocommunism. He's like, well, that's a different way of doing things, right?
Yeah, I think there's a real tension between, like, I think to a degree it can happen where the East and the West are like made into these absolute categories, despite the fact that they've been interlinked for like ever since antiquity. Like there's the Japanese or Chinese people. I'm not sure if people actually visited the Roman Empire, but they talk about each other. There's stuff going on. It's just not that like it's not like the Silk Road is up or anything like that. But so there's the tension of, yeah, these things are connected. They're not absolutely distinguished in two different separate categories. But at the same time, then you have, well, go 100 miles and things are a lot different. And trying to hold those two contradictory ideas together, I think, are important. At least that's one of the things that I'm definitely getting out of going through the Chinese Marxism, the history of Chinese Marxism.
Should we move on to the last essay? Because it's quite long. I don't actually want to go through it in too much detail. I just wanted to, there's some nice stuff in it. So I just wanted to maybe give us the chance to pull out, we don't have to do it too systemic.
Yeah, please do. Yeah, it's 25 pages long.
I just wanted to, so that this is the present situation in the task before us. So there are 3 goals, he says. He says in international affairs, we must continue to oppose hegemonism, to strive to preserve world peace. There's a consensus throughout the world that the 1980s will be a dangerous decade. So the task of opposing hegemonism will be in our daily agenda. The 1980s are off to a bad start with the Afghanistan affair and the Iranian affair, not to mention the Vietnamese and Middle Eastern questions, which came up earlier. There may be many similar problems in the future. In a word, the struggle against hegemonism is a grave task, constantly confronting our country. Second, we must work for the return of Taiwan to the motherland for China's reunification. We will endeavor to attain this goal in the 1980s. It will be an ever-present and important issue on our agenda. There may be twists and turns in the course of its development. Third, we must step up economic construction. That is, we will step up the drive for China's 4 modernizations. To put the matter in a nutshell, the 4 modernizations mean economic construction. Without sound economic foundations, it will be impossible to modernize our national defense, and science and technology should primarily serve economic construction. So by the way here, this is written in 1980. So he's saying, where are we, right? Where are we going? Right, from the standpoint of 1980. I just wanted to pull out a few interesting things here. He talks about criminal law reform. Did you guys take a look at that passage on page 178? Yeah. I didn't know this, but he said we had no criminal. We've had no criminal law for 29 years.
I did not know that was.
I mean, I don't think he literally means. I think he means there was no firm codes. Right.
Yeah, there wasn't a judicial system, because he's talking about the development of judicial system here. Obviously there's your local customs and just the stuff that you see in any sort of feudalistic society or even really kind of 100 years ago. It's just been relatively recent that we have a fully standardized legal code.
Yeah, and he talks about 2.9 million people who were accused in the Maoist era being rehabilitated, right, and brought back into service. And actually later on, he goes on quite a bit about Liu Shaoqi. Later, this is interesting as well. You see it, with Western Maoist movements who try to carry out the People's War in Hamburg. Yeah, that's. I think he's probably talking about Baader-Meinhof, but not the most dialectical or subtle development. I got to say, like Western Maoists. I don't want to say everybody, but a lot of the radical groups are a bit embarrassing. So again, he goes over the anti-rightist struggle that happened in the late 50s, which he continues to say, oh, that was good, but we went too far. And actually, one thing Deng will stress coming up, which I think is, interesting, is he really, really, whenever he talks about problems in the party, he always kind of distances himself from too lofty a position. He's like, yeah, well, we're criticizing the Cultural Revolution. He's like, but by the way, I was guilty of that too. And actually, this is true biographically. If you go through all these things Deng criticizes, he was involved in most of them in some way, right? So when he criticizes the Great Leap Forward in the Cultural Revolution, it's not like he wasn't complicit, right? So that's he has to kind of recuse himself a little bit. So here he says, we've removed the label stinking number 9, which we talked about from intellectuals, and the labels landlord, rich peasant, and capitalist from the overwhelming majority of persons formerly in those categories. Okay. Isn't this a major political event involving the whole nation? Yes, Deng. I like that rhetorical.
No.
I love how he always goes back to Lin Bao and the Gang of Four or whatever.
Yeah, great.
I don't even know what Lin Bao. I think he died years before this 71 or something. Anyway.
Yeah, he died at the beginning of the 70s.
Yeah. I mean, I think he knows. It's kind of when he talks about Lin Bao, it's kind of whatever. That's my impression. But I think he's just it's a refrain. He's like, oh yeah, Lin Bao. It's he's dead. It's not doing any harm just to blame him for stuff. Just takes the weight off other people a little bit.
It makes sense. I mean, here in Mexico, again, to draw the comparison, so we had a decade. We had about 37 years when we had a president who was a liberal actually, right?
Mhm. Yeah.
And he says, so, you know, we had our independence, right? Our independent movement was great. We have a Mexican government now. I'm the Mexican president now. So, but things are a little bit rough, right? We're being invaded from the north, from Europe. So how about I stay president, right, for a while? And that while, you know, turned into years and years and years, right? And that actually turned into the Mexican Revolution.
Yeah.
Right.
Mm-hmm.
And right now, our president Obrador, he will usually draw comparisons to both that decade, that time period, the Porfiriato, and the Salinista period, the neoliberal period in Mexico, right?
Mm-hmm.
And it feels the same way, right? He's always saying, "Oh, it's Porfirio Diaz," and "Oh, it's Salinas," right? But I think, you know, and of course Deng is doing this, right? I think that's, you know, that's pretty clear that he's just making an allusion to the historical consequences, right, of their political interference, right? It's not that Lin Biao and the Gang of Four are personally responsible for the struggles of that time, but their actions in the past created the conditions for the conditions in the present, right?
Yeah, well, there's short form and long form Deng. So short form Deng is like, yeah, the fault of, you know, it's Lin Bao and the Gang of Four. Long form Deng is like, individuals aren't responsible for these things. These are like a consequence of like general structural and socioeconomic tensions. And oh, by the way, I was also responsible for all these things. Like, so you know, you get, again, this is what I said. Like, he functions at it's this tension between like the reduction of things to these slogans, you know, which he's conscious, I think, of the need for in terms of practically communicating this stuff, and like the more complex analysis, which you do find. He talks here about literature and art. The flourishing of the new socialist man means politics. The new socialist man will, of course, work hard for the interests of the people, defend the honor of the socialist motherland, and dedicate himself to a future. Literature and art can have an enormous impact on ideological trends among the people, particularly among young people, as well as on social stability and unity. So he gives his and he talks about working hard with a pioneering spirit. He again goes back to this idea, you know, the Gang of Four just sort of want poverty. He says we should get 1,000 US GNP by the end of the century. By the way, China handily exceeded that. And I don't know if I don't know if he just assumes the reader is going to calculate whatever he's saying for inflation, because 1,000 GNP doesn't seem like it was calculated for inflation when he says it. 1,000 GNP per capita, right? That's the goal. China, by the way, now I think it's like 11,000 US per capita, right? So it's quite telling when you look at these economic goals they set, because they tend to surpass them, right? Yeah, so that's something. He compares the marketable coal that they have from China. He says the USSR is 724 million tons, we're US 599, us 630. So we're doing okay, but then if you think of our population, we actually kind of suck. He talks about Lao and Lai. You know, Lao and Lai always gets praised. Sorry, I'm just going through. I hope you guys don't mind me going through this. Like,
no, it's 25 pages. So
yeah,
go ahead.
He says that some infiltration of bourgeois ideology is inevitable. Because of the 10-year rampage of Lin Bao and the Gang of Four, which is an interesting causal reasoning. He makes fun of Taiwan. He says, like, some people have said we're going in the direction of Taiwan, and he says we should hope not, because their economy is completely dominated by the United States. LOL. So not going to do that. That's actually something people never really, you know, when people say China's capitalist, they don't take into consideration usually enough, you know, the capital controls which are used to stymie foreign ownership, right? Which really, you know, I think someone said in our group the other day, like, oh, China's just Singapore. It's just, you know, it's like China's not Singapore, quite categorically, right? Not only because the historical comparison is so ridiculous, but it's an ex-colonial British port, but also because of the difference in the way that, you know, if you just want to say, well, yeah, they created private markets, then okay. But there's a lot more going on there right now in terms of the details. I should add, by the way, Singapore and these countries were an inspiration on China in the Deng era, right? But the inspiration was mostly in terms of like, managerial practices and the development of productive forces, right? They didn't want to go in the direction of having foreign countries annex huge parts of the economy, right? Let's see here. Improving party leadership. We're almost done here. He goes back to the guys putting the big poster characters in the wall. This is actually, I love when Deng gets his fixated on something. You'll love the next part of it because he gets fixated on a film called Unrequited Love, which I couldn't find in IMDb, but he keeps bringing it up in speech after speech. He's like, unrequited love is like a bash on our government. Yeah, and then he talks about the history of the Communist Party. Its fourth National Congress that had between 900 and 1,000 members. Yet it succeeded in bringing about cooperation between the Kuomintang and the Communist Party and in pushing forward the Northern Expedition. Later, when the revolution suffered defeats, only a party such as ours was able to survive 10 years of bloody terror, the encirclement and suppression campaigns by armies of millions strong, and the 25,000 Lee Long March. And I do love how I do love how Deng has this like good old day, the old days. He's always going back to the old days. He actually complains about party members. He's like when we joined, being a party member was the worst thing in the world. He's like, these guys now, they just join it to get perks. Ridiculous. Yeah, here it is. Actually, just as I said that, and it was not easy to be a party member then. If you were a party cadre, a company commander, or a platoon leader, you often had to carry 2 or 3 rifles on the march, one for yourself, the others for comrades. Now some party members are different. They join the party in order to be the first to enjoy comforts and the last to bear hardships. When we talk about opposing privilege seeking, in fact, we have in mind the conduct of some party members and cadres. That's why we say that as we go about restoring our party's fine traditions and style of work, we face a problem about the qualifications of party members. The question of whether a communist meets the requirements for party membership applies not only to new party members, but also to a number of veterans. So our party really does need consolidation. At present, we have a total of 38 million members. If each and every one of us measured up to that standard, what a mighty force we would have. The problem now is that a number of party members don't measure up, so we must consolidate the party through education. And finally, at the end, he says, China needs our party to accomplish modernization. Similarly, China's prominent position in the international struggle against hegemonism and for human progress presupposes the existence of the party, right? So that is the conclusion. Any thoughts on that one, by the way, guys? Any thoughts on that long essay? Which I think quite mercifully for you guys went through and just extracted some nice parts from. It's long, but I do think there are just nice bits in it that are worth looking at. Any thoughts on that, though?
Well, like Ender was saying a couple of minutes ago, Andres Manuel has tried to make a kind of a similar move with his party, right? In the regard that he's trying to create, as I think he mentions it in the second text that we read, or the first one, that the party should set an example for the people, right? That members of the party are examples for other members of the party and examples for society. And well, at least here in Mexico, we see a lot of the opposite, right? I'm sure the United States has even more, with the concentration of capital there, right?
Yeah.
But there's certainly been a movement here in Mexico to create a new party, the Morena, right? Where the members are allegedly, for the moral good. It hasn't been the case, of course.
Yeah.
But as Ender was saying, are we trying to create something similar? I think we are. I think without a party, how do you organize a government, and how do you organize a society, right? And certainly, I'm not very proud of what the party is now and of its leaders, right? But I'm certainly interested in moving it, towards a place where people can be proud to be part of it.
Yeah. Well, and I think every, party or no, every left-wing organization has to, too often people have just have treated it like we have the truth and no one else has the truth.
Yeah.
And they have been looking at the contradictions in society. They've been thinking abstractly. What I've really tried to, in my own way, what I've really tried to encourage in Zero Books Capital Comrades is pragmatic, dialectical and materialist analysis of situations, and also not discussions very important, but not unnecessarily creating hostility.
Yeah.
Right. You know, because I think now, like, if you look at the situation of the left, I mean, for, you know, in the West, you know, which I can speak of most authoritatively, you know, it's been really 13 years of like sustained, 13 or 14 years of like sustained economic duress, right, in one form or another, you know, which has now reached this really traumatic climax with COVID. I hope it's the climax. But I think, you know, the left has been relatively unable. There's been some gains, but they haven't been so effective in exploiting, you know, the popular frustrations which exist, right? So I think that it calls for a more general reassessment of strategy, right? But one thing that I do like about what has been accomplished by the left is that there's been a movement toward the creation of like new mass parties, right?
Yeah.
You know, I think the mistake of those mass parties has been to you know, assume that it would be possible to do things in like an easy way, you know, without struggle. Like, we'll just parachute Bernie Sanders in, everything will be okay. Not being realistic about the level of organization that's going to be required to affect these sort of changes, the level of struggle, the opposition to the status quo that's required pragmatically, right? You know, in order for these developments to shoot forth. So those are all things, but I think it at least creates something to work off of. But, you know, I think what I really don't like now is people, you know, like, you know, you see this even with AOC's comments about Biden, right? People say, you know, like when Biden won, people were like, you know, I saw some people on anarchist post on, I don't mean to demonize anarchists, there's some great anarchists, but I saw some anarchist posts on Twitter and they were saying something like, you know, like if you think Biden, you know, really won because of like the mainstream media and corporations, you know, you're like a patsy. You know, the people who got him to win were really like, you know, Antifa types and ethnic minorities, you know, from poor communities, you know, going like knocking on doors and it's like, well, there's an element of that that's true, right? But I guess what I don't like, you know, is this what AOC was saying with Biden, like, oh, they're pivoting toward like being like a pro-working class administration. You know, I mean, there may have been, surely there's been some influence exerted on the political system by the far left, but this stuff is just fucking delusional. Right, to be frankly honest about it. So I think, you know, this is like what Deng says. Like, we have to acknowledge how awful our situation is if we want to like realistically improve it, right? I'm not saying there aren't things that can be built upon, but like, we have not won. We're not winning. Right?
In America, we've been losing for a very long time. In the West, and in America in particular, losing for quite a
I'm talking about the West. That's what I said. You know, I'm not. You know, I'm not
talking
about third world movements. You know, and I'm not to say they're winning, but I just mean it's maybe a bit of a different analysis. But I think we have to, and we also have to acknowledge how primitive we are in every way, right? You know, like if you look at, you know, magazine, you know, look, there's some really great content in magazines like Jacobin. You know, and I think it's great that there's a more left-wing magazine that has such a broad circulation. You know, we have some very good intellectuals and polemicists, maybe more of the latter than the former. But, you know, it's like if you compare the quality of thought emanating from like, you know, sort of like DSA circles, you know, Anglophone left, like what was happening in Italy in the 60s or 70s or something in the left, it's totally vacuous by comparison, right? You know, and we're talking about a much larger population base, right? So this is what I mean. It's like, there are good people, there are great people, don't get me wrong, but they tend to be few and far between. You know, we have very few really innovative thinkers, you know, very few people who've digested this material at a high level. And that's just on the intellectual side, but I'm saying it's a reflection of the general malaise. You know, and there are lots of, you know, and that's what I mean. It's like, when you look at a place like China, it's not about China being perfect. It's just like, we should have the humility to look at and not say, oh, they've done everything right in every way, but just have the humility. And I think it's going to help, you know, stave off imperialism as a mentality as well, right? But have the humility to look at groups that have organized in the third world without saying they're perfect, to examine them and think about all of that, you know, and not say like, you know, we're the Anglophones, you know, we're very democratic, we love human rights, you know, these are just, you know, tankies, you know, like, it's like, you know, honestly look at this stuff and see what your position is and, you know, see how weak you are too.
Yeah, there's a certain problem that I've noticed, and this is probably true. It's definitely an American problem, and probably holds for a lot of the West as well. Left organizing is essentially stuck with an NGO category scheme. So it's with it, it's the you see this transition and from like the Bowling Alone has talks about some of the history, but like you see a movement from like the 50s to like the 80s where membership in organizations has to do with like you just write a check, very minimal, not really asking a lot of the organization, and it sets up a binary between like your like head, like there's a clear like top of the organization, the people who are doing things, and then there's just the people who are around who are members that just kind of exist on who just exist on paper, who maybe provide resources, but there isn't that there's no sense of the whole in this kind of framework, nor is there really the ability for critique. And that's especially where you start to see it's like, here's the plan, here's our goal, here's what we're doing, and you start seeing like a change of directors. You don't, if someone fucks up, like if there's a change, they just leave, they just disappear. And so like there's no real continuity, there's no history that's like in like a, you know, Mao or Deng or these people that rule for decades, or somebody who's been around for decades and who will admit the limitations and will self-critique, where you see in this one person at the leadership of the country in this case, the history of the development of the organization. And just within the NGO type, you don't see it within that form. If there's a new period, there's just a new everything, and it doesn't hold on to the change.
Yeah, well, I mean, you know, of course, like, you know, Mark Fisher talks about, you know, the future sort of being canceled by capitalism. I mean, we could also talk about the past being canceled by capitalism, right? You know, and I think it does, you know, the need to ultimately, when you progress towards a more moderate, like towards like a more revisionist position, the need to kind of, you know, declare amnesty upon the whole society ultimately can only articulate itself as a kind of amnesia, right? Because of the violence, which is very central to the way that capitalist societies function, right? I mean, I find it absolutely astonishing in, you know, a Western left context. And look, I understand the strategic imperatives that guide it, but even so, I find the lack of discussion of imperialism and you know, rent extraction from the third world absolutely dispiriting, right? And I think that it completely, as regards China, I think it completely causes people to not be able to understand, you know, the significance of China's model. Now, which I'm not saying is perfect, but like, you know, maybe their biggest accomplishment, you know, is to have accomplished like modernization in a way that, you know, develops the productive forces while eschewing rent extraction, right? Western rent extraction. So if you're not even thinking critically about that, then you're never going to get to that point. You know, yeah, these are all serious issues, and it makes me a bit depressed thinking about them. But I want to put an accent on one final point. I hope I didn't bring this up last week. When we and by the way, did we talk about what are the four modernizations and what are the four cardinal principles? Did we talk about that?
We mentioned the four principles, but I don't think we mentioned the four modernizations.
Oh, let me
find a copy, unless you have it readily at hand. I was only able to.
He says here, class struggle, the struggle for production and scientific experiments. Do you have the four modernizations there? Do you have the
four modernizations were goals first set forth by Deng Xiaoping to strengthen the fields of agriculture, industry, defense, and science and technology in China. They were adopted as means of rejuvenating the Chinese economy in 1977, following the death of Mao Zedong, and they were among the defining features of Deng Xiaoping's tenure as the paramount leader of China. Yeah, that's it. Just four modernizations in fields of agriculture, industry, defense, and science and technology.
Okay. Yeah. So I just wanted to just stress that because he brings it up. But I want to put a final, with that done, I just want to put a final note here. I don't know if I mentioned this last time, but I'm always pleased when I make speculations or theorize about Deng and then it turns out to be sustained by the text. So that's part of why I was so happy with this market socialist economy, because I think we actually talked about that earlier. But I will say, because I had said, you know, Mao's, you know, writings on contradiction and talked about the productive forces. So I found sort of an empirical referent here on page 138 where, 138. So I guess we didn't talk about this. But Deng says, as for the question of what the principal contradiction in the current period, what is the main issue or central task confronting the party and the people in the current period? Actually, this question was answered by the decision of the third plenary session of the 11th Committee to shift the focus of our work to socialist modernization. The level of our productive forces is very low and is far from meeting the needs of our people and country. This is the principal contradiction in the current period and to resolve it is our central task, right? So again, we see there a very, very clear statement of and a clear example of Deng using Mao's theory of, primary, secondary, here principal contradiction to justify his campaign to raise the level of the productive forces, right? So definitely, it's very helpful. Actually, it shows you how helpful it was to do the Mao before. Because if you don't, I don't think if you don't understand on contradiction, for example, I think it's very hard to understand. How that seems to be the most important one. It's very hard to understand how subsequent leaders are going to think, right? Okay, so that's nearly 2 hours. It's a long one. Do you want me to just tell you what ones we got coming up for next week?
Yeah, please do.
Okay, so these will be shorter, don't worry. We have from 1980, we have an important principle for handling relations between fraternal parties, which I quoted from already in the group. Also from 1980, we have answers to the Italian journalist Oriana Falaschi, which I'd read through already because I quoted my thesis, which is a very nice one. And thirdly, we have from 1982, we have Combat Economic Crime, in which Deng addresses some of the crime problems that have emerged because of the partial liberalization of the economy. So I think it's an important thing to acknowledge, right? Because you had no crime apparently in China in the, crime, in China in the earlier period, very low crime in any case. But when the economy started to open up, right, you had haves and have-nots, right? And you began to see a more criminal spirit emerge in some places. And he's also addressing corruption, which became a huge problem, frankly, enormous problem, right? In the SCZs like Zhuhai and Shenzhen, just rampant, right, all over. So it's interesting because he's starting to pivot and to have to deal with the consequences, the negative consequences, right, of some of the campaigns that he's launched. Okay, guys, so that's nearly 2 hours. Are we good? Does anyone else want to say before we log off?
I'm good.
I'm good as well.
Well, I see this has been a nice one. We got quite a few people, and there's still 15 people here at the end, which is nice. Sometimes we're sitting here with just a couple people. I was quite tired today. I told you I had an early flight from Rome, but I'm glad we got through it. Anyway, thanks, Tim and Ernesto. Of course, your comments are always so wonderful. And thank you to our audience here, who have been, I think, quite consistent in coming out.
Yeah, thank you.
Taking interest. And we'll be back next weekend with Chinese Marxism 10. Is that it? 10?
Yeah, 10.
10?
So
Yeah.
9 today, so I think it's 10. But
It is 10.
mistaken.
It says 9 up here.
Okay. Yeah, it's 9 there. Yeah. Okay, that's right. Yeah, see, I'm tired. And then we're going to, by the way, just so you guys know, we're projecting for I think 17 sessions with the Governance of China Volume 1, which by the way, all these texts, just so everyone knows, all the texts we're doing, you can get on Library Genesis, or you can buy them. And actually I didn't want us to do the later volumes of the Governance of China because they're not as easy to obtain for free. So I didn't want to, I thought it wouldn't be as interesting if people couldn't freely get the material and go through the stuff. Because it can be quite cumbersome to, pay Jeff Bezos to get your Chinese Marxist books. Anyway, I'm sure there's another place to order it. Anyway, thank you to our audience. Thanks everyone. And we will see you next Sunday. Goodbye.
Bye everyone.